S&S was started in 1958, but the story starts way before that. George Smith was a speed freak, and his vehicle of choice was a motorcycle. At the time, the Harleys were the biggest bikes around, so that's what he used. He was a drag racer, and he won the Midwest Championship in 1952. He went to Bonneville in 1954, set a record. And in 1958, he started S&S Cycle with his friend Stanley Stankos. Yeah, there are some people who credit S&S Cycle, George Smith in particular, with actually starting the Harley aftermarket. Because until that time, there really was nothing. And he provided kits and products that would make these bikes go faster. The approach that George took was to solve the next problem that was stopping these bikes from going faster. And the first product that S&S put out was push rods, because the valve train in the old Harleys just couldn't handle high RPM, and in order to make more power, that's what he needed to do, is get them to spin faster. He'd already done the push rods, the valve train was stable. He'd made bigger engines with stroker flywheels, but he needed to get more air into these engines, and that is the key to the whole performance thing. So he experimented with dual carburetors, very expensive way to go, but in the mid-60s he designed the first S&S carburetor. They became famous because of these carburetors, so much bigger than the stock carburetors that the stock air cleaner wouldn't fit on them. So he designed the teardrop air cleaner simply to go on the S&S carburetors. As the technology improved and S&S was making more and more power with these engines, more things were breaking, and of course we had to build new parts to replace the stock parts that couldn't take the stress. Eventually, we had enough parts to make a new engine. In the early 1990s, Harley-Davidson wasn't keeping up with demand on motorcycles. When there's a vacuum in a market like that, somebody will step in to fill it. And Illusion was probably the first manufacturer to start building aftermarket motorcycles. But what they needed most was an engine. It was a marriage made in heaven. These guys could build frames and put motorcycles together, and we provide the engines. And S&S really took off. In 1999, we built a new building here at S&S, and the board of directors mandated that we have a museum, because we have a lot of artifacts that we have accumulated over the last 50-odd years, and they're all now together in one place where people can see them. And as you walk through the S&S museum, you'll get a feel for the history of S&S Cycle, starting in 1958 in Blue Island, Illinois, and ending up here in Viola.